Charles Grant was a man of towering wealth and unrelenting arrogance. His presence dominated every room he entered. A billionaire entrepreneur, he had built his empire from the ground up, believing his success justified every ounce of his brash demeanor. To him, the people who served him were merely a backdrop to his greatness, less than the wealth they helped him amass. The restaurant where he chose to have his morning coffee was no different. A sleek, upscale cafe, it catered to the elite, well-dressed patrons and polished wait staff, all working in sync to provide a flawless experience. But Charles's need for control extended far beyond the confines of his business. It crept into every interaction, especially with those he deemed beneath him. This particular morning, the waitress assigned to his table was Maya, a young black woman with striking features and an air of quiet resilience. She moved with purpose, balancing trays of food and drinks in her hands with a practiced grace. She had been working at the cafe for several months, learning to navigate the delicate balance of customer service in a world that often expected more from people like her. Charles's morning had already been frustrating. The deal he had been working on for months had fallen apart the night before, and he was irritable. As Maya approached his table with his coffee, his temper finally snapped. She reached out with the steaming mug, but as she did, her sleeve brushed against the side of the table. The cup wobbled, and before she could steady it, the contents spilled. Hot coffee splashed across the front of Charles's expensive, tailored suit. He recoiled, eyes blazing with anger. "You incompetent fool!" he yelled, the words echoing through the quiet cafe. Maya froze, her face paling as she stammered an apology. But Charles wasn't finished. "Do you have any idea how much this suit costs? Do you think you're worthy of serving someone like me?" His voice was filled with contempt, every word calculated to humiliate her. Maya's heart raced, her face burning with shame. She had seen customers like him before, those who treated her as less than human, as if her worth was measured by the service she provided, not her humanity. But today, something inside her snapped. She kept her head low, her hands trembling as she grabbed a napkin to clean the coffee. Charles sneered at her. "This is what happens when you hire idiots who can't even carry a cup properly," he muttered, loud enough for others to hear. His words sliced through her, each one a reminder of the prejudice she had spent years learning to endure, to push aside, to ignore. But Maya didn't ignore it. She didn't apologize again. Instead, she stood up straighter, looked him in the eye, and whispered, "I'm sorry for the coffee, sir, but your attitude is what's truly offensive." Her words were quiet, measured, but they were a stark contrast to the venom that had spewed from his mouth. Charles blinked in disbelief. How dare she speak to him like that? His face flushed with a mixture of shock and rage. He was used to being feared, to being in control, but this woman, this waitress, had the audacity to speak to him as if she was his equal. The very thought enraged him even more. Without warning, he picked up the coffee mug and threw it at her, the contents splashing across her uniform, staining it dark brown. The force of the action startled the other patrons, and for a moment, the cafe fell into an eerie silence. Maya stood frozen for a moment, the coffee dripping from her face and clothing. Her breath was shallow, but she refused to look away. She didn't flinch. She had seen worse in her life, heard worse in the street, in schools, in the workplace. But this was different. This was public, brutal, and unchecked. The video of the incident, captured by a patron who had whipped out their phone in disbelief, went viral within hours. The cafe's social media pages exploded with outrage. Comments flooded in, calling for an apology, for accountability. Maya, caught in the eye of the storm, became the face of the injustice. Her strength was recognized, even as her dignity had been violated. She didn't ask for this spotlight, but she couldn't ignore it either. As her phone buzzed with messages and notifications, she knew her life would never be the same. She was being watched, and her silence wasn't an option anymore. Charles, on the other hand, sat back in his luxurious penthouse, completely unaware of the storm that was brewing around him. He poured himself another glass of expensive whiskey, his mind already moving on to the next challenge, never once considering that his actions had consequences. He had always been untouchable, an untarnished figure whose wealth and power shielded him from the wrath of those he had wronged. But that was before today. Across the city, Maya's phone buzzed again, this time with a call from a lawyer. "Maya, we've been seeing the video. You have a case. He needs to pay for what he did." But Maya wasn't so sure. She was conflicted. This wasn't about money for her. It was about standing up against the systemic racism, the everyday cruelty that people like Charles perpetuated without a second thought. But something else tugged at her, an ancient belief her grandmother had shared with her, about a curse tied to the cafe. A spirit that only revealed itself when injustice was pushed to the breaking point. That night, as Maya lay in bed, the eerie stillness of the air around her felt unnatural. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something beyond the video, beyond the comments. The universe, or fate, seemed to have thrown them into this moment for a reason. She wasn't sure what it was, but she knew she couldn't turn away now. The next morning, she would return to the cafe, and she would face the consequences of what had unfolded. But for now, she would sleep, knowing the storm was far from over. The tension had only just begun. What had seemed like a simple moment of humiliation was about to become something far more significant than either of them could have predicted. Charles woke to the shrill sound of his phone vibrating on the nightstand. Rubbing his eyes, he glanced at the screen, expecting another business call or email demanding his attention. Instead, it was a news alert. He opened the notification with a groggy frown, expecting nothing of consequence, but the words on the screen caught him off guard. Asterisk. Billionaire throws coffee at waitress. Online outrage ensues. Asterisk. A rush of heat flooded his face as he scrolled through the details. The video was everywhere. His outburst, his arrogance, his cruelty, it was all captured in crisp, humiliating clarity. The internet was exploding. Every platform was abuzz with discussions of racism, privilege, and the sheer audacity of a man who could treat someone so violently over something so trivial. Charles quickly closed the app, but the damage had already been done. His name was trending, not for his business acumen, but for an act of mindless cruelty. His phone buzzed again, and this time it was a call from his PR team. "Mr. Grant." The voice on the other end was tense. "We need to respond. The video's gone viral. You need to release a statement, immediately. The public's furious. Who cares about some viral video?" Charles snapped. "It's a joke. It'll blow over." But even as the words left his mouth, he knew they were hollow. This wasn't just some passing controversy. The reaction was severe, the anger palpable. "We've already had inquiries from several major outlets," the PR representative continued. "Your company's reputation is at risk, sir. The investors are worried." Charles stared at his phone in disbelief. He had always been in control, always the one who made the calls. But now, in an instant, his carefully constructed world was crumbling. He had never been this exposed, this vulnerable. He tossed his phone aside, his mind racing. The last thing he needed was a public scandal. His wealth, his success, none of it would matter if he lost his reputation. He needed to act quickly, but he didn't know where to start. His thoughts were interrupted by an unusual sound, a soft, eerie whisper that seemed to echo through the room. It wasn't a voice he recognized, yet it carried an unsettling weight. At first, he brushed it off as his imagination, but as he focused, the whispering grew louder, more distinct, as if it were coming from the very walls themselves. He stood up and looked around the room, his heart pounding. The windows were shut tight, the door locked. There was no logical explanation for the noise. It felt unnatural, like a presence that had no business being there. His phone buzzed again, snapping him from his growing unease. Another call. This time, it was from one of his closest business partners, James. "Charles." James' voice crackled with a mix of concern and disbelief. "What the hell happened yesterday? People are saying you assaulted that waitress. There's talk of legal action. This isn't just bad press, it's dangerous." Charles's mind reeled. He had thrown a coffee. That was it. What was the big deal? It wasn't like he'd done anything physical, just a moment of frustration. But the weight of the situation was becoming clearer with each passing second. The anger was one thing, but this was turning into a crisis that threatened his entire empire. As he paced around the room, his thoughts were interrupted by another whisper. This time, it was unmistakable, clear, chilling. It felt like a voice, but not human. It seemed to hum with a malevolent energy. "You will pay for what you've done." Charles froze. His pulse quickened. The hair on the back of his neck stood up. He turned slowly toward the source of the sound, his eyes scanning the room. Nothing. Yet the sensation of being watched lingered. He shook his head, trying to calm himself. "It's just stress," he muttered to himself, his voice more out of habit than belief. "Just a glitch, nothing more." But the eerie whispers continued, growing more insistent, each word heavy with a sense of impending doom. "You can't escape me," the voice whispered again. The temperature in the room seemed to drop, and Charles felt a sudden chill on his skin, like a cold draft had swept through the room. His mind raced as he tried to make sense of what was happening. Was he losing his grip on reality? Could the pressure of the scandal be affecting him this badly? He reached for his phone again, but the screen was blank. His heart skipped a beat. The phone wasn't working. Nothing was working. It was as if the very air around him had gone still, frozen in time. As the whispers grew louder, Charles's panic escalated. He stumbled backward, knocking over a chair, the noise startling him. "Who's there?" he yelled, his voice cracking with fear. No answer came. But the presence in the room, that suffocating weight, felt undeniably real. The door to the room creaked open, sending a fresh wave of terror through him. He spun around, but no one was there. The room was empty. Yet Charles couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched by something ancient, something vengeful. Desperate to escape, he hurriedly left the room and made his way to the elevator. As the doors closed behind him, the whispers seemed to follow, echoing in his mind. "Come back!" they hissed. "You're not done yet!" Charles couldn't shake the sense that something had shifted. The world he had known was crumbling around him, and with it, the fabric of his own reality seemed to warp and distort. At that moment, he realized that the consequences of his actions weren't limited to public outrage or legal battles. Something far worse was happening. The universe had decided to hold him accountable, and there was no escaping the wrath that was coming for him. Meanwhile, Maya was struggling with the aftershocks of what had occurred. The humiliation from Charles's outburst still burned within her, but something far more disturbing was now on her mind. As the video spread, it wasn't just her that people were talking about. The cafe, a place she had come to rely on, was now infamous for all the wrong reasons. But it wasn't just the public outrage that kept her awake at night, it was the strange feeling that something far darker was at play. The whispers? The strange pull she felt when she walked past the cafe. Something about it felt different, ominous even. It was as if the very air had changed, as if the spirit of the place had woken from a long slumber, and it was angry. Maya had heard the stories from her grandmother, the legends of a restless spirit who had been wronged in life, someone who had suffered the same kind of injustices that she now faced every day. Could it be that the curse her grandmother had warned her about was real? Was this the reason for the sudden surge of activity, for the shift in the energy surrounding her? She didn't know yet, but one thing was certain: Charles Grant's actions had awakened something far more dangerous than a simple social media backlash. She would have to face whatever was coming, whether she was ready or not. The atmosphere in Charles's penthouse grew more oppressive with each passing hour. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just beyond his perception. Every corner of his sprawling home seemed to be watching him, waiting for him to falter. The whispers hadn't stopped. They followed him everywhere, in the elevator, across the marble floors, even in the shower. At night they grew louder, more distinct. "You will pay," the voice repeated, a low, guttural tone that seemed to crawl beneath his skin. He had tried everything to drown it out: blaring music, expensive wine, even pills to calm his nerves. Nothing worked. The presence was always there, suffocating him in its weight. His once pristine world was now a nightmare of his own making. And it wasn't just the haunting whispers. His business was in jeopardy. The media storm around the coffee incident had escalated into a full-blown crisis. Investors were pulling back, clients were canceling meetings, and his company's stock had taken a nosedive. Social media users had labeled him a racist and an abuser, calling for boycotts and protests. His carefully constructed empire was unraveling, and with each new headline, his reputation slipped further into the abyss. Charles stared at the stacks of paperwork on his desk. Contracts, spreadsheets, and proposals, everything he had worked so hard to build seemed irrelevant now. It didn't matter how many zeros were on his bank balance. His wealth couldn't shield him from the consequences of his actions. He had always thought he was invincible, that money and power could solve everything. But now, even his money seemed impotent against the growing storm. In the midst of the chaos, one thought began to dominate his mind. The voice, the whispers, they weren't just in his head. They were real. And they were linked to the cafe. To Maya. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. What had happened yesterday wasn't just a random outburst. It had stirred something far more dangerous. Something ancient. Something vengeful. He needed answers, but he wasn't sure where to look. Desperation crept in. He had already tried reaching out to the cafe, but they refused to talk to him. The owner, a quiet man named Mr. Williams, had no comment. Maya was nowhere to be found, her social media silent and her whereabouts unknown. Charles had no way of contacting her, but he knew that she was the key. If she knew the lore of the spirit tied to the cafe, she could help him, if she wanted to. As his mind raced, he made a decision. He would go to her. Find her, confront her, and make her understand that this wasn't his fault. He hadn't meant to hurt her, to throw the coffee, to humiliate her in front of everyone. His outburst had been a momentary lapse of judgment, nothing more. If she could just see that, maybe she could help him undo whatever curse had been unleashed. But even as he planned his next move, a sense of dread gnawed at him. What if Maya didn't want to help him? What if she was just as consumed by the anger of the incident as the internet seemed to be? He had already seen how quickly public opinion could turn against him, and he knew that this wasn't something that could be easily fixed with a simple apology. Charles gathered his things and left his penthouse, his thoughts scattered. As he drove through the city, the familiar sights felt foreign. The buildings that once symbolized his power now seemed cold, indifferent, as if mocking him. The streets were quieter than usual, the world outside seeming to hold its breath in anticipation of something terrible. He arrived at the cafe just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The glowing lights of the sign did little to ease his growing unease. It was the same place, yet everything about it felt different. The air seemed thicker, charged with an energy that made his skin crawl. He stepped inside, and the bell above the door rang with an unsettling finality. Maya was behind the counter, her back to him as she worked. She didn't look up when he entered, but he could see the tension in her shoulders. She had to know he was here. The whispers grew louder as he walked toward her, as if the very building was urging him to turn back. "Maya!" he called softly, his voice hesitant. She didn't turn around. She kept working, her movements mechanical. It was as if she were trying to block out his presence, to pretend he wasn't there. "Maya, please," he said again, this time more urgent. "I know what happened was wrong. I didn't mean it. Her voice interrupted him, cold and measured. "You didn't mean it?" She turned slowly, her eyes narrowing with a quiet intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. "You didn't mean to throw coffee at me? You didn't mean to humiliate me in front of everyone?" Charles flinched at the accusation, but she wasn't finished. "You didn't mean to treat me like I was less than human? You didn't mean to destroy my dignity for your own amusement?" He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. He had no defense. No excuse. He had acted out of anger, out of a sense of entitlement. And now, he was paying the price. "I'm sorry," he finally managed to say. "But I need your help. Something's happening. I don't know how to explain it, but it's real. The whispers, the strange feeling. It's like I'm being haunted. And I think it's because of what I did to you. Maya's eyes softened for just a moment, but the hardness quickly returned. You think the whispers are because of you? She asked, her voice laced with disbelief. No. They're because of what you did, and who you are. You're not the victim here, Charles. You never were. He took a step forward, desperation creeping into his voice. Please, I need to make this right. You have to help me. I don't know who else to turn to. Maya didn't say anything for a long moment. She just stood there, staring at him with a mixture of contempt and pity. You don't get to make it right, she said softly. Not like this. Not after everything you've done. Charles's heart sank. He had never felt so powerless, so utterly alone. The whispers were growing louder now, as if urging him to leave. He felt a pressure building in his chest, a suffocating weight that seemed to grow with every second. I can help you, Maya said quietly, her voice steady now. But not because you deserve it. You don't. You need to learn what it means to be accountable, to understand the harm you've caused. Only then will you have a chance to be free of this curse. Charles nodded, not fully understanding, but willing to do whatever it took. He had no choice now. He was at the mercy of forces far beyond his comprehension. And somehow, the only person who could save him was the very person he had hurt. Maya looked at him one last time, her gaze filled with a quiet strength. You've begun your journey, Charles. But whether you'll ever find redemption depends on you. And with that, she turned away, leaving him standing in the middle of the cafe, alone with the whispers and the weight of his actions. Charles sat in his sleek black car, staring out the window at the city lights that blurred by. His heart pounded in his chest as the conversation with Maya replayed in his mind. The realization that he was now at the mercy of his own guilt was like a weight he couldn't shake off. He had wanted to fix things, to erase the damage he'd caused, but now, it felt like a distant dream. The truth was, he was just as lost as he had been before all of this started. The car sped down the streets, but Charles didn't care. The journey didn't matter. He couldn't focus on anything but the overwhelming sense of doom that had begun to follow him since his outburst. The whispers in his mind had grown louder, sharper, and more insistent. Every corner he turned, every step he took, they followed him, just out of sight but always there, tugging at his sanity. He had tried to call his therapist, but his calls went unanswered. He hadn't even bothered with his assistant. Nothing could fix this. Nothing but Maya. And even though she had been less than forgiving, she had hinted at something he didn't fully understand, something about accountability. She had spoken with such quiet authority, as though she knew the path he would need to walk to find some kind of redemption. The more he thought about it, the clearer it became that Maya held the key to everything. She knew the lore of the spirit, of the curse tied to the cafe. But it wasn't just about the spirit, was it? It was about his actions, the choices he had made in his life. Maya had pointed out the harm he had caused, the way he had treated people like they were disposable. His wealth, his success, had always made him feel above others. But now, all of that had crumbled. He wasn't above anyone. He was human, flawed, imperfect, and vulnerable. And for the first time, he was forced to confront the consequences of his arrogance. The car stopped outside his building. Charles stepped out, feeling the weight of the night pressing down on him. He walked up to his penthouse, each step feeling heavier than the last. As he entered his home, the whispers returned, filling the empty space like an echo of his darkest thoughts. In the living room, the lights flickered. Charles stopped in his tracks, his breath catching in his throat. The temperature in the room dropped, and he could see his breath in the air. Panic surged through him. He had experienced the strange occurrences before, but this felt different. It was as if something was there with him, something tangible. The air was thick with an energy he couldn't explain. He grabbed his phone, dialing Maya's number without thinking. It rang, but she didn't answer. He left a message, his voice shaky. Maya, it's Charles. Please, you have to help me. I don't know what's happening, but something's changing. I need you. Charles hung up, feeling the weight of his own helplessness pressing against him. He was so close to losing everything, and the one person who could help him had turned her back on him. He couldn't blame her, not really. He had acted terribly, and now, he was paying the price. The whispers grew louder again, surrounding him like a swarm of bees. His chest tightened, his heart racing. There was something wrong, something malevolent in the air, something more than just the haunting whispers. It was as if the very walls were closing in on him, and he could feel the presence of the spirit growing stronger with each passing second. He stumbled back, his mind spinning. He needed to get away, to think clearly. But where could he go? He didn't have the answers, and he wasn't sure where to find them. The only thing he knew for sure was that Maya was somehow connected to the curse. She understood it in a way that he couldn't. Charles sank into the couch, his head in his hands. He was trapped in his own guilt, his own recklessness. Every decision he had made had led him to this point, and there was no escaping the reality that he had caused pain to the people around him. Maya had been right. He had never taken accountability for his actions. He had always relied on his wealth and status to shield him from the consequences. But now, the world was different. It wasn't just about the public scandal or the financial losses. It was about something deeper, something far more personal. The phone buzzed in his hand, snapping him out of his spiral of thoughts. It was a text message from an unknown number. "We need to talk," the message read. "Meet me at the cafe." Charles's heart skipped a beat. Maya. She wanted to meet. Without hesitation, he jumped up, grabbing his coat. He had no idea what was coming next, but he knew that this was his chance. His chance to make things right, to stop the haunting, to stop the curse that seemed to have taken over his life. As he drove back to the cafe, a sense of urgency gnawed at him. The whispers were louder now, more insistent, as if warning him that time was running out. He couldn't afford to lose this opportunity. The cafe loomed in front of him, bathed in the dim glow of streetlights. He parked and rushed inside, his eyes scanning the room for Maya. She was sitting in a corner booth, her face illuminated by the soft light above her. She looked calm, but there was an underlying intensity in her gaze, something he hadn't seen before. "Sit," she said, gesturing to the seat across from her. Charles hesitated for a moment before sitting down. His heart was pounding in his chest, and he wasn't sure what to expect. Maya didn't speak right away. She just studied him, her expression unreadable. "I know you want to stop this," she said finally, her voice steady. "But stopping it isn't enough. You have to understand what you've done. You have to face the consequences, not just for yourself, but for everyone you've harmed along the way." Charles felt a lump form in his throat. He had always seen himself as the victim in all of this, but Maya was right. He had been the one to inflict harm. He had been the one to throw the coffee, to belittle her in front of everyone. And now, he had to make amends. Maya leaned forward, her eyes locked on his. "The spirit you're dealing with, it's not something you can just wish away. It's tied to your actions, to your heart. And if you don't change, if you don't learn what it means to truly be accountable, it will never stop haunting you." Charles nodded, his throat dry. He had no words left, just a sense of deep, aching regret. He had started this journey, and now he had to see it through to the end. "I'm ready," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Maya nodded. "Good. Let's begin." Maya stood in the middle of the cafe, her hands folded neatly in front of her. She had always known that Charles's arrogance wasn't just about his wealth. It was the way he carried himself, above others, untouchable. The events of the past few days had forced him to confront something far deeper than the public scandal, or the haunting spirit. His journey toward redemption had begun, but Maya wasn't going to make it easy for him. Not when he had caused so much harm. Charles stood across from her, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. He was beginning to realize that this wasn't going to be a quick fix. There would be no magic solution or easy way out. He had to face the truth, and that meant acknowledging the pain he had inflicted on the world around him. "You're here because you want to change," Maya said, her voice calm but firm. "But you need to understand something. Change doesn't come from just saying the right things. It comes from doing the right things. It comes from holding yourself accountable." Charles nodded slowly. He had spent his whole life thinking he could buy his way out of trouble. Money had always been his solution, but now, in this place of eerie quiet and dread, he realized there was no amount of money that could fix what he had done. "I understand," he muttered, though his voice shook with uncertainty. "I've been living in denial. I've been blind to the pain I've caused." Maya's eyes softened for a moment. "It's not just about acknowledging the harm. It's about what you do with that acknowledgement. You have to prove you're worthy of redemption." Charles swallowed hard, his throat tightening. "I don't know where to begin." Maya glanced toward the empty corner of the cafe, as if considering something. "The first step is admitting to yourself that you're not above anyone else. You've used your wealth and status to dehumanize people, to make them feel inferior. That's where this all started. You can't fix things until you start seeing people for who they really are." Charles felt a sharp pang in his chest. He had thought himself superior for so long, treating people as tools or obstacles. He had always assumed that his success gave him the right to control, to dictate the lives of others. But now, standing here, listening to Maya, it was becoming painfully clear how wrong he had been. "I never thought about it like that," Charles admitted, his voice heavy. "I was always focused on myself, my empire. I didn't care who I hurt along the way." Maya nodded. "That's the problem. The moment you stop caring about others is the moment you lose your humanity. And that's what brought you to this point. The spirit didn't just appear because of one bad act. It's here because of a lifetime of selfishness." The air grew colder, the temperature dropping rapidly. Charles could feel the ghostly presence stirring in the corners of the cafe, its energy pressing down on him. Maya seemed unfazed by it, as though she had grown accustomed to the haunting. "The spirit is a reflection of your past," Maya continued. "It's tied to the pain and suffering you've caused. You think you're haunted by the supernatural, but it's the guilt, the consequences of your actions, that you need to reckon with." Charles shivered, though he couldn't tell if it was the cold or the weight of Maya's words. "I'm afraid," he whispered. "Afraid of what I'll have to face. Afraid of losing everything." "You've already lost it all," Maya replied, her voice unwavering. "Your reputation, your peace of mind, your sense of control. You're just too afraid to see it. But the real loss will be if you don't change. If you don't stop running from your own mistakes, you'll never be free." Charles's eyes darted to the corners of the room, the shadows seeming to grow longer, more oppressive. The spirit's presence was undeniable now, almost suffocating. He could feel it, this dark force that seemed to be consuming him, just waiting for him to crumble under the weight of his own guilt. "I can't do this alone," Charles admitted, his voice hoarse. "I need help." Maya's gaze softened, though her expression remained serious. "You're not alone anymore. I'm here. But you need to understand, the first step toward redemption is acknowledging the harm you've done and taking responsibility for it. You can't run from this anymore." The whispers filled the room once more, louder now, as if responding to Maya's words. The air grew thick with tension, and Charles's heartbeat quickened. The spirit wasn't just a threat to his wealth or reputation. It was a reflection of the darkness within him, a dark mirror that was forcing him to face his worst fears. Maya's eyes locked onto his. "The curse can only be lifted when you're ready to make things right. And that starts with the people you've wronged. You need to go back to those you've hurt, those you've belittled, and ask for their forgiveness." Charles stared at her, feeling a mix of disbelief and fear. "You want me to apologize to everyone I've ever wronged?" He shook his head, unable to fathom how he could do that. "They'll never forgive me. It's too late." "It's never too late," Maya said firmly. "Forgiveness isn't about whether they'll accept your apology. It's about you making peace with your past. You need to confront your actions, to make amends where you can. Only then can you be free of this curse." Charles felt a knot form in his stomach. This wasn't what he had expected. He had thought he could just pay off the right people, fix the damage with a few well-placed apologies and donations. But Maya was right. He needed to face the people he had hurt, to look them in the eye and admit the wrongs he had done. He thought of all the faces, the people who had served him, who had bent to his will without question, the ones he had disregarded because they weren't important to him. The thought of facing them, of apologizing for the damage he had caused, seemed unbearable. But it was the only way forward. "You're right," Charles said quietly. "I can't hide anymore. I can't keep pretending I'm something I'm not. I've done terrible things, and I need to face that." Maya's expression softened further. "That's the first step. Facing yourself. Now you need to take action. You need to make it right." As Charles stood there, the weight of Maya's words pressing down on him, he realized that this was just the beginning. The path to redemption wouldn't be easy, but it was the only path that would lead him out of the nightmare he had created for himself. The spirit that haunted him, the guilt that gripped his soul, could only be laid to rest when he took full responsibility for his actions. And so, with a heavy heart and a renewed sense of purpose, Charles made a promise to himself. He would not run anymore. He would face the consequences of his past, no matter how difficult, and begin the long journey toward redemption. The day Charles entered the small community center was unlike any he had ever experienced. The sunlight barely filtered through the dusty windows, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch out in every direction. Inside, the walls were lined with flyers, community notices, and banners promoting equality and justice. But what caught his attention was the large group gathered at the back of the room, people of all ages, races, and backgrounds. They were talking, laughing, but mostly sharing stories. The energy in the room was palpable, filled with hope, struggle, and a quiet strength. He had heard of this place before, a sanctuary for those who had been wronged by the system, by life, or by people like him. A place where people came to rebuild what had been taken from them. It was a place where justice wasn't just a concept, it was a practice. Charles felt an overwhelming sense of unease as he stepped further into the room, his polished shoes clicking against the worn wooden floor. He had never been in a space like this before. His wealth and status had never allowed him to be in such close proximity to people who had been treated as less than. Yet here he was, standing at the threshold of a moment that would define the rest of his life. He had already spent days trying to make sense of the haunting, the curse that had followed him ever since the coffee incident. The guilt, the shame, the sense that something was closing in on him, demanding retribution. He had been forced to confront his past, to recognize the hurt he had caused. But now, standing in front of these people, he understood that the true reckoning had only just begun. One woman caught his eye, her gaze steady and unyielding. She stood at the head of the group, listening intently as others spoke about their struggles, their pain, their hopes for a better future. There was an aura of quiet power around her, something Charles hadn't expected from a group like this. She was unafraid, unashamed. Her strength came from within, not from the validation of others. It was then that Charles realized that this was no ordinary group. These weren't just victims of circumstance. They were warriors. Warriors who had fought for their dignity, their rights, and their voices. And now, they were opening their hearts to him, a man who had done everything in his power to silence them for years. Maya's voice broke through his thoughts, calm but firm, as if she had been waiting for him to catch up. "You're here to make things right," she said softly, but the weight of her words hung in the air like a challenge. "And you're not going to do it by throwing money around or making empty apologies. You're going to do it by standing here, in front of the people you've wronged, and telling them the truth." Charles nodded, his throat tight. This wasn't just about redemption. It wasn't about restoring his reputation or easing his own conscience. It was about acknowledging the real harm he had caused, the real lives he had destroyed with his privilege and his pride. It was about showing these people that he was willing to make amends, to face the full consequences of his actions, no matter how uncomfortable or painful that might be. He cleared his throat and took a step forward. The room fell silent, the murmurs dying down as all eyes turned to him. Maya's gaze never wavered, and it was in her eyes that Charles saw the reflection of his own fears, his own uncertainty. But it was also in her eyes that he saw the possibility of redemption, the chance to do something that mattered, something real. He took another step, his voice cracking as he began to speak. "I'm here because I've been given a chance to make things right," he began, his words tentative at first. "I've spent my life thinking I could buy anything, that money would fix all problems. But that's not the truth. The truth is I've hurt people. I've belittled them. I've made them feel less than. And I've done it for years, without ever thinking about the consequences." The room was still, every ear tuned to his words. He could feel their judgment, their skepticism. He didn't expect them to believe him, not yet. He didn't expect forgiveness. He hadn't earned it. But he was willing to try. For the first time in his life, he was willing to be honest. "I'm sorry," he continued, his voice growing stronger. "I'm sorry for every person I've treated like they didn't matter. For every time I thought my wealth made me better. For every time I used my power to crush someone else's dreams. I can't change the past, but I'm here today because I want to make a difference moving forward." Maya stepped forward, her presence commanding yet compassionate. She didn't say anything, but her eyes told Charles everything he needed to know. This was the moment of truth. There was no going back. The silence in the room was thick, almost suffocating. For a long moment, no one spoke, and Charles felt the weight of their stares, the judgment in their silence. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, the terror of rejection clawing at his insides. But he didn't look away. He couldn't. Finally, a voice broke through the tension. It was deep, firm, and filled with the kind of strength that could only come from years of enduring hardship. "You're not the first person to come in here and try to make amends," the man said, his eyes narrowing as he studied Charles. "But you'll be the first to prove you mean it. That's what matters." Charles nodded, his throat thick with emotion. "I will prove it," he said, his voice determined. "I'll do whatever it takes. I'll face everyone I've wronged. I'll take responsibility for my actions. I know I can't undo the damage I've caused, but I want to make things right. I want to help." The man nodded slowly, as if weighing his words. After a moment, he stood and extended his hand. "Then we'll help you. But it's going to take more than words. It's going to take action." Charles shook his hand, his grip firm but humble. For the first time in his life, he felt like he was standing on solid ground. He didn't know what the future held, or how he would fix all the damage he had caused. But in that moment, surrounded by people who had been wronged and had risen above it all, he knew one thing for sure: redemption was possible. And it started with him, right here, right now. Maya's eyes met his once again, and he saw something in them that he hadn't seen before: hope. For the first time, he believed in the possibility of change. Not just for him, but for everyone he had wronged. Charles had no idea how long he had been sitting there, in the quiet corner of the community center, the weight of his decisions pressing down on him with each passing moment. The group had dispersed, gone home, or moved on to other things, but he remained, struggling to process the enormity of what had just happened. The room was empty now, save for a few lingering faces who gave him occasional glances, as if waiting for him to make the next move. The air felt different in the space now. He could feel it in his bones, in the way his chest tightened with the realization of what he had to do. This was no longer just about him. This was about undoing the harm he had caused, about restoring some measure of dignity to those he had wronged. It was about accountability. It was about facing the truth of who he was and what he had become. His mind wandered back to that day in the cafe, to the moment when he had thrown that coffee. The smoldering hatred in his eyes, the disgust he had felt in his gut as he looked down on the waitress. The memory made him sick to his stomach, but it was also the catalyst for everything that had followed. The curse, the haunting, the nightmare that had torn apart his life. But now, for the first time, he realized that it wasn't just the supernatural forces at play that had caused his downfall. It was his own actions. He had thrown coffee at a person, not just any person, but someone who had already faced enough of life's cruelty. And that moment, that small act of disrespect, had spiraled into something far greater than he had ever imagined. Karma had come for him in a way he could never have anticipated. It had awakened something much older, much darker than he could have fathomed. But as Charles sat in the emptiness of the room, he began to see a clearer picture. He had been given a rare chance, not just to redeem himself, but to help others. He had been given the opportunity to change, not just his own fate, but to help steer the course of others' lives for the better. The waitress, Maya, had shown him that there was something more than the power of money. There was the power of empathy, of community, of understanding. He thought of the women and men who had walked out of the room earlier. They had all come from different walks of life, but they had one thing in common: they had all been oppressed, discarded, and ignored by people like him. But they had risen. They had found strength in each other, and they had built something that could not be easily destroyed. They had created a sanctuary, a place where justice was not just a word, but a living, breathing entity. Charles thought of his own journey. The man he had been, arrogant, self-righteous, dismissive of others. The man who had used his wealth to control, to belittle, and to demand. But now, sitting in the quiet of that community center, he realized that he didn't want to be that man anymore. He didn't want to be the embodiment of privilege and prejudice. He didn't want to be the man who threw coffee at a woman just because he thought he could get away with it. He thought about Maya, how she had stood up to him without hesitation. She had shown him that real power wasn't in material wealth, but in resilience. It was in the ability to keep going, to keep fighting, even when the world seemed determined to hold you down. It was in the ability to forgive, to heal, and to move forward with strength. But now, the question was not whether he could change. He had already begun that process. The real question was, could he help others change too? Could he be a force for good, or would he continue to let the chains of his past actions drag him down? He had a long way to go. There was no quick fix, no magical solution to the damage he had caused. But he had to try. He had to keep going, not for his own sake, but for the sake of everyone he had harmed. He thought about the community he had walked into that day. How they had accepted him, despite his past, despite the things he had done. They hadn't just offered him forgiveness, they had offered him a chance to grow, to learn, and to become someone who could stand with them, not against them. And now, Charles was ready to take that next step. He stood up from the corner of the room, his legs stiff from sitting for so long. His mind was clearer than it had been in days, the fog of confusion and fear lifting slowly. He walked toward the door, and as his hand gripped the handle, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't walking away from the past, not exactly. He was walking towards something better. Something more. Charles stepped out into the bright daylight, the sun hitting his face with a sharp clarity. He felt alive in a way he hadn't in years. He could see it now, the path ahead, the road that led to true redemption. But it wasn't just about redemption. It was about doing the work, about proving through action that he was serious. That he was committed to making things right. And he knew that the hardest part was yet to come. In the weeks that followed, Charles began to take small but significant steps. He reached out to the people he had wronged, apologizing, listening to their stories, and understanding their pain. He worked with local organizations that advocated for the marginalized, for the voices that had been silenced. He learned what it meant to stand in solidarity with those who had been oppressed. He worked alongside them, not as a benefactor, but as an ally. And over time, he started to see the changes in himself. His heart began to open to the struggles of others, and his understanding of what true leadership meant grew deeper. He had once thought that power was measured by what you could take, by what you could control. But now, he understood that power was measured by what you could give, by the impact you could have on others, by the example you set, by the change you inspired. As time went on, Charles didn't just rebuild his reputation. He rebuilt his life. He didn't just repair the damage he had caused, he built something new. Something stronger, something more inclusive, something that could stand the test of time. And as for the ghost that had haunted him, the spirit of revenge, it faded with time, as karma often does when it is acknowledged, confronted, and atoned for. Charles never forgot what had happened, but he also never let it define him. Instead, he chose to live with purpose, with empathy, and with the unshakable belief that redemption wasn't just a second chance. It was a lifelong commitment to doing better, to being better. And that was the true legacy he wanted to leave behind. Charles stood in front of the mirror, his reflection staring back at him, the man who had once been consumed by power, greed, and arrogance. He could still see the echoes of his former self, lurking just beneath the surface, but it no longer dominated him. He had come a long way from the man who had thrown coffee at a woman without a second thought. That moment, which had seemed so insignificant at the time, had shattered his life and forced him to confront everything he had been running from. But now, as he looked at himself, he knew he had changed. He had become someone new, someone who had learned the hard way what it truly meant to be accountable. It wasn't easy, and the path had been fraught with challenges. His attempts at redemption hadn't been smooth. People hadn't forgotten the billionaire who had once wielded his money as a weapon. His name had been tarnished, and some believed it could never be restored. But Charles didn't care about their opinions anymore. He cared about the people he had wronged, the people who had helped him find his way out of the darkness, the ones who had shown him what it meant to be human. In the weeks since the haunting had ended, since he had confronted the ghosts that had tormented him, Charles had made it his mission to make amends, not just for the sake of his own redemption, but for the sake of others. He had realized that true change came not from simply acknowledging his past mistakes, but from actively working to undo the damage. It was easy to feel sorry for yourself, to wallow in guilt and shame. It was much harder to take responsibility and actively fight to make things right. His thoughts turned to Maya, the waitress, the woman who had been the catalyst for his transformation. She had known the story of the vengeful spirit long before he did, and yet she had been the one to step up when everyone else had backed away. She had offered him her help, despite his past actions. She had shown him the path to salvation, but it hadn't been an easy one. She had made him confront his own demons, and that was something he would never forget. Maya had been the embodiment of resilience. When Charles had thrown that coffee at her, when he had thoughtlessly made her the target of his rage and prejudice, she had every right to turn her back on him. But instead, she had chosen to help him. She had chosen to lead him out of the nightmare he had created. And through her guidance, he had learned the value of empathy, of understanding, of standing up for others, even when it wasn't easy. He remembered the first time they had spoken after the haunting began. It had been at the community center, after he had stood before the group and apologized for his actions. Maya had been there, watching, silent. She had given him no reassurance, no easy comfort. Instead, she had asked the tough questions. She had made him face the truth, even when he didn't want to hear it. And in doing so, she had forced him to look inward, to examine his own heart and motivations. Charles had come to understand that true heroism wasn't about grand gestures or saving the day. It wasn't about being the person everyone turned to for help. It was about being willing to admit your mistakes and work tirelessly to make things right. Heroism was about standing in solidarity with those who needed it the most, about using your position and your resources to uplift others, not to tear them down. It had been a long and difficult road, but Charles had never been more determined. He had seen the impact of his actions, the ripple effect of his mistakes, and he knew that in order to truly make things right, he had to go beyond just saying the words. He had to show up. He had to listen. He had to be present for those who had been oppressed, for those who had been ignored by the systems of power that had once allowed him to thrive. His mind shifted to the larger picture. The cultural shift that was happening around him. People were starting to wake up to the realities of injustice, of systemic inequality, of the ways in which the world had been tilted in favor of a select few. Charles had been one of those people who had never truly seen it before, who had never understood the struggles of others. But now, he was seeing it in full force. He saw it in the faces of the people he had met, in the stories they told, in the pain they carried with them. He thought about the concept of diversity and inclusion. About how real change came when everyone, regardless of their background, was given an equal opportunity to succeed. He thought about the ways in which people had tried to break through the barriers that had been placed in their way, how they had fought for the rights they deserved. And he thought about his own role in that fight. He had once been the person who perpetuated those barriers. But now, he was the person who could help dismantle them. It wasn't just about undoing the harm he had caused. It was about building something new, something better. It was about fostering a culture of empathy and understanding, where people didn't just see each other as obstacles to overcome, but as partners in the journey toward equality. It was about creating spaces where everyone could thrive, where no one was left behind. Charles had come to understand that this was not a one-time effort. It wasn't a checkbox to tick off, a task to complete and move on from. This was a lifelong commitment, one that required constant work, constant reflection, constant learning. It was about growing into the person he wanted to be, not just for himself, but for the world around him. And through it all, Maya had remained by his side. She had helped him navigate the complexities of his transformation, and in doing so, she had shown him what true leadership looked like. She had led not through authority, but through compassion. She had led by example, showing him that the best way to lead was to serve others. And that was the kind of leader he wanted to be. As Charles walked out into the world that morning, he knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult. But he also knew that he wasn't alone. He had learned the value of mentorship, of learning from those who had walked the path before him. And with that knowledge, he was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, knowing that he had the strength to make a difference. He was ready to continue the work he had started, to continue making amends, to continue building the world he wanted to see. And in doing so, he hoped that he could leave behind a legacy not of arrogance and greed, but of empathy, of understanding, and of true transformation.